Where does human character truly begin? Prenatal consciousness, moral responsibility, and the origins of antisocial traits. Ladies and gentlemen, one of the most persistent illusions of modern society is the belief that human character is something that suddenly appears at adulthood, fully formed, autonomous, and solely responsible for itself. We speak of personality as if it were a finished product, a personal possession, something that belongs exclusively to the individual who carries it. Yet philosophy, long before psychology and neuroscience, warned us that this view is dangerously incomplete. Human character is not forged in a single moment. It is not born overnight, and it is certainly not created in isolation. From Plato to Aristotle, from Augustine to Kant, from Confucian ethics to Buddhist psychology, thinkers across civilizations have wrestled not only with the question of where we come from, but more urgently with how we are formed. And one of the most uncomfortable conclusions they reached is this: the roots of who we become extend far earlier than we would like to admit, earlier than childhood, earlier than memory, earlier even than birth itself. This is where Tibetan Buddhist philosophy introduces a radical, but surprisingly modern idea. In the Bardo teachings, consciousness does not vanish at death, nor does it leap instantly into a new life. Instead, it passes through an intermediate state, a threshold condition where it is exquisitely sensitive to emotional forces, symbolic forms, and experiential patterns. In this liminal space, the mind is not choosing rationally. It is being oriented. It is being shaped. Now, here is the philosophical inversion that demands our attention. If consciousness can be oriented after death by the emotional and perceptual forces it encounters, then the same mechanism operates before birth as well. When a fetus first begins to register the world, not through language, not through concepts, but through rhythm, chemistry, and emotion, vibration, it is already forming its earliest interpretive framework. The womb is not a biological waiting room. It is the first classroom, and emotion is the first curriculum. Long before a child learns words like safe, dangerous, trust, or threat, the nervous system has already made those distinctions. These judgments are not conscious decisions, they are embodied conclusions. They become the silent assumptions upon which later personality is built. What we casually call temperament or character is, in large part, the echo of those earliest impressions. Philosophy pushes us further. If character is formed through layered processes, prenatal emotion, early attachment, relational patterns, and social context, then the way we assign moral responsibility must change as well. When we reduce antisocial behavior, criminality, or emotional coldness to individual defect alone, we commit a category error. We mistake outcome for origin. This does not mean that individuals lack responsibility. It means responsibility has a history. Human beings do not emerge as isolated moral agents. We are relationally constructed temporally, shaped and emotionally patterned long before we ever exercise conscious choice. Parental emotional climate, early caregiving styles, genetic predispositions, and broader social structures interweave to form the psychological and ethical foundation of a person. To speak seriously about antisocial traits, therefore, is not merely to diagnose pathology. It is to examine continuity across generations. It is to confront shared responsibility. And it is to ask a question that modern culture often avoids. What does society owe to the conditions that produce character? This lecture stands precisely at that point of confrontation. Our goal is not to romanticize prenatal influence, nor to burden parents with unrealistic standards of emotional perfection, nor is it to resurrect mystical explanations detached from empirical grounding. Instead, we will integrate insights from developmental psychology, attachment theory, and contemporary neurobiology with the symbolic intelligence of Tibetan Bardo philosophy. Why do this integration at all? Because the convergence is too striking to ignore. Modern neuroscience confirms that the fetal brain is exquisitely responsive to maternal stress hormones. Developmental psychology demonstrates that early emotional environments shape empathy, impulse control, and moral sensitivity. Attachment theory reveals that the capacity to recognize another's suffering depends on early relational safety. Tibetan philosophy, centuries earlier, described the same phenomenon in symbolic language consciousness, shaped by emotional resonance before rational thought ever appears. Our concern, therefore, is not merely academic. These insights have concrete implications from deeply personal decisions, such as evaluating family emotional environments before marriage or childbirth, to large-scale societal questions about early intervention, parenting support, and public policy design. When families assess potential in-laws, they intuitively understand something philosophy confirms. Character is inherited, not only genetically, but emotionally. When governments debate early childhood investment, they are unknowingly debating the architecture of future moral agency. This lecture is an invitation to see these connections clearly. We will not ask only what is wrong. We will ask, what should we pay attention to? And more importantly, what can still be changed? If these questions resonate with you, I encourage you to stay with the argument as it unfolds. In the sessions that follow, we will examine empirical evidence, clinical patterns, and real-world cases that demonstrate how antisocial traits emerge not as destiny, but as probability shaped by environment. For those who wish to go deeper, this channel will continue to provide extended analyses, case studies, and practical frameworks for parents, educators, and policymakers alike. Subscribers will receive early access to detailed intervention, strategies, and comparative case breakdowns in upcoming lectures. Now, let us move forward into the core inquiry that anchors everything we have discussed so far. Where do antisocial tendencies truly begin? And once we see their origins clearly, what, if anything, are we morally obligated to change? Who shapes the antisocial mind? Mothers, fathers, and the architecture of moral development. So far, we have established a crucial premise. Antisocial tendencies do not emerge out of nowhere. They are not spontaneous moral failures, nor are they simply the product of a single traumatic event. They are developmental outcomes shaped gradually through biology, emotion, relationship, and environment. And this brings us inevitably to the next question. If antisocial personality traits are formed through early emotional and relational structures, whose influence matters more, the mother's or the father's? At first glance, this may sound like a simplistic comparison, even an unfair one. But in reality, this question sits at the very center of developmental psychology, attachment theory, behavioral genetics, and modern neuroscience. Research frequently states that approximately 40% of the risk for antisocial personality disorder, ASPD, can be attributed to parental influence. But what does that number actually mean? Let us be very precise here. When researchers speak of 40% parental influence, they are not referring to parenting behavior alone. This figure represents a combined contribution of genetic predispositions passed down from parents, early caregiving environments, emotional response patterns modeled in infancy and early childhood. In other words, this 40% reflects not what parents say, but who they are, how they regulate emotion, and how they relate to the child long before moral reasoning develops. So, does that influence lean more heavily toward the mother or the father? The honest scientific answer is this. Their influences are fundamentally different, which makes direct comparison misleading. However, from a clinical and developmental perspective, certain patterns appear with remarkable consistency, and those patterns are worth examining carefully. The mother's role architect of the early emotional regulation system. Across decades of research, from John Bowlby's attachment theory to Mary Ainsworth's observational studies, to contemporary developmental neuroscience, we see a recurring conclusion. In the earliest stages of life, the mother's emotional patterns tend to exert a more immediate and more direct influence on the child's internal regulation systems. Between birth and roughly age 3, the child's brain undergoes explosive development in areas responsible for emotional regulation, empathy formation, threat detection, impulse inhibition. During this period, the primary emotional reference point for most children is the mother. This is not ideology. It is biology and proximity. When a mother is chronically anxious, emotionally withdrawn, prone to uncontrolled anger, or inconsistently responsive, the child's nervous system adapts accordingly. The child does not interpret these conditions consciously. Instead, the brain encodes implicit rules. The world is dangerous. Others cannot be relied upon. Strong emotions are overwhelming and uncontrollable. These early assumptions correlate strongly with adult traits commonly observed in ASPD. Reduced empathy, emotional blunting, heightened impulsivity, difficulty regulating aggression. From the standpoint of early emotional calibration, the mother's influence tends to be more proximal and more foundational. The father's role modeler of social rules and behavioral boundaries. Now let us be very clear. To say that the mother's influence is more direct in early emotional regulation does not mean the father's influence is weaker. In many respects, it is equally powerful, just expressed through different channels. Fathers often exert their strongest influence through modeling of social behavior, transmission of moral norms and boundaries, demonstration of authority, restraint, and rule adherence. Research consistently shows elevated ASPD risk in environments where fathers are violent or aggressively dominant, inconsistent or arbitrary in enforcing rules, emotionally absent, engaged in chronic conflict with the mother. For male children in particular, the father's behavioral modeling is strongly associated with later patterns of aggression, risk-taking, legal violations, dominance-oriented social strategies. In short, while the mother shapes how emotions are processed, the father often shapes how power, rules, and authority are understood. Gender differences in parental impact. One of the most revealing findings in recent research is that parental influence is not uniform across genders. In boys, ASPD traits are more strongly associated with the father's behavioral modeling, especially patterns involving aggression, rule violation, and dominance. In girls, antisocial traits are more frequently linked to failures in early emotional attunement, with the mother manifesting as emotional detachment, relational aggression, or distorted attachment patterns. This does not mean that one parent is responsible and the other is irrelevant. It means that the same parental failure expresses itself differently, depending on the child's sex and developmental context. The most dangerous configuration. Emotional absence meets normative collapse. Clinicians repeatedly converge on one conclusion. The highest risk for ASPD emerges, not from a single parental failure, but from a specific combination. Emotional unavailability or dysregulation from the mother. Absence of consistent moral modeling from the father. When these conditions coexist, the child internalizes a bleak social logic. No one is emotionally safe. Rules are arbitrary or meaningless. Power is the only reliable tool. At that point, antisocial behavior is not rebellion. It is adaptation. So who matters more, mother or father? The correct answer is not who, but where. In emotional calibration and empathy formation, the mother's influence is more immediate. In social norms, moral boundaries, and behavioral modeling, the father's influence is often stronger. ASPD risk rises most dramatically when both domains fail simultaneously. A hard but practical question. Why should we evaluate family environments before marriage? This brings us to a deeply practical and often uncomfortable question. Why do experienced clinicians and developmental psychologists insist that when preparing for marriage, family environment matters more than financial assets? Because marriage is never just a union between two individuals. It is a convergence of two developmental systems. Personality, emotional regulation, conflict style, and attachment patterns are shaped, roughly half by genetics and half by upbringing. When you marry someone, you are not only choosing a partner, you are aligning yourself with the emotional, behavioral, and moral patterns that shape them. That is why I state this plainly. When evaluating a future spouse, the character of their parents matters more than the size of their inheritance. Not because parents determine destiny, but because they establish probability. Why the past matters. Genetics and environment across generations. Many people believe that genetics only pass on physical traits. This is a serious misunderstanding. Genetic predispositions exist for impulsivity, emotional stability, anxiety and depression, aggression, empathy, stress tolerance, rule adherence. But environment activates or suppresses these predispositions. From birth to roughly age 7, children do not learn primarily through instruction. They learn through observation and emotional imitation. How parents argue, how they express affection, how they handle money, stress, frustration, and authority. All of it becomes the child's internal template. Marriage, therefore, is not merely romantic. It is intergenerational. We are now ready to move forward. In the next section, we will examine in concrete terms the key indicators that should be evaluated in a partner's family. Background, beginning with one of the strongest predictors of future risk: parental history of criminal behavior. Why does it matter so much? And how should it be interpreted not emotionally, but rationally? Let us proceed carefully. Patterns that marry forward. How parents' lives quietly shape their children's marriages. In the previous section, we reached a difficult but unavoidable conclusion. When two people marry, they are not merely choosing each other. They are stepping into a system of inherited tendencies, genetic, emotional, behavioral, and moral. This is precisely why questions about parental history, criminal records, mental health, and moral consistency are not intrusive curiosities, but rational forms of foresight. Now, let us move forward. If parents shape the internal architecture of a child's birth, emotional and moral life, then the most honest way to evaluate a future marriage is not to look at isolated traits, but to examine patterns. And patterns reveal themselves most clearly in how parents live with each other, manage resources, regulate desire, handle truth, and resolve conflict. Fifth, the quality of the parent's marriage predicts the child's marriage almost exactly. Psychologists often state a simple but unsettling truth. People do not invent their model of marriage. They reenact the one they witnessed. Children may consciously reject their parents' relationship, but unconsciously, they reproduce its emotional logic. Marriages become dangerous templates when the parental relationship is marked by chronic contempt or dismissal, verbal degradation, infidelity, emotional Cold Wars, explosive anger, persistent avoidance of responsibility. In contrast, healthy marriages consistently display different traits: low emotional volume, cooperative problem solving, mutual respect, emotional repair after conflict, predictable responsibility sharing. Marriage does not follow intention. It follows familiarity. Sixth, financial habits reveal character more than net worth ever will. When evaluating a future spouse's family, the critical question is not how much money they have, but how they relate to money. Warning signs include hidden debt, gambling behavior, chronic overspending, repeated impulsive investment failures, persistent financial conflict within the family, responsible financial behavior planning, transparency. Restraint is one of the strongest predictors of marital stability. Money is not just currency. It is a moral instrument. Seventh, addiction, where genetics and environment collide most violently. Addiction is one of the clearest examples of intergenerational transmission. Alcohol, drugs, gambling, sexual compulsion, and shopping addiction all involve both inherited vulnerability and learned coping strategies. Children raised in households marked by addiction often develop impaired emotional regulation, heightened impulsivity, distorted reward processing. Addiction does not stay contained within the individual. It reorganizes the emotional climate of the entire family. Eighth, patterns of deception and manipulation destroy the foundation of trust. Families that normalize exaggeration, manipulation, chronic lying, speaking maliciously behind others' backs, breaking promises, exploiting others, teach children a corrosive lesson. Relationships are tools, not commitments. Trust, once eroded at the family level, rarely recovers fully in adulthood. Ninth, parents' social relationships predict the child's relational longevity. Be cautious of families where parents have no long-term friendships, chronic workplace conflict, severed ties with extended relatives. Isolation rarely occurs without cause. Children internalize these social patterns and often replicate them, forming unstable, short-lived, or conflict-heavy relationships of their own. 10th, emotional expression is the first curriculum of human feeling. Parents teach emotional literacy not through lectures, but through expression. Patterns such as emotional explosion, emotional absence, passive aggression, constant criticism leave children without a usable framework for processing emotion. They grow up knowing that they feel, but not how to feel. 11th, conflict resolution is learned at home, not in marriage counseling. How parents resolve conflict determines how their children will resolve conflict in marriage. Healthy families demonstrate responsibility taking, genuine apology, negotiation skills, separation of emotion from problem solving. Where these skills are absent, marriages struggle regardless of love or intention. 12th, physical health and genetic history are ethical information, not social taboo. Family medical history, cancer, cardiovascular disease, diabetes, autoimmune disorders is not about blame. It is about preparation. Most genetic risks can be managed with awareness, screening, and preventive care. Information empowers responsibility. 13th, religion and worldview. Beware of extremes, not belief itself. Religion is not inherently problematic. Extremism is. Warning signs include belief systems that justify control, demonization of outsiders, doctrines that override personal boundaries, attempts to regulate spouses through religious authority. Such systems often generate intense post-marital conflict. 14th, parents' attitude toward their adult children. Finally, observe how parents relate to their adult children. Both extremes are dangerous. Excessive interference, emotional dependence, financial entanglement, over-control, or converse, total neglect, irresponsible detachment. Marriage inevitably answers these questions. How much will these parents intervene? How will they influence parenting decisions? These dynamics must be understood before marriage, not after. The core message: marriage may look like the union of two individuals. In reality, it is the intersection of two inherited systems, genes, habits, emotional scripts, and moral patterns. Wise parents do not evaluate wealth. They evaluate patterns. Patterns shape temperament. Temperament shapes character. Character shapes relationships. Relationships shape marriage. Marriage shapes the next generation. Let me close with one sentence. Wise parents do not look at money. They look at patterns, because patterns, not luck, determine the future of a family. If today's discussion expanded your perspective even slightly, I invite you to subscribe to this channel. A single click is a small habit, but insight, practiced consistently, reshapes generations. Thank you for listening.